The sun was beginning to sink on the horizon, tinting the sky with shades of red and gold as Raphael advanced through the Mexican desert. He was there for work, on an archaeological expedition that had taken him to the most isolated regions of northern Mexico, where supposed caves hid artifacts from ancient civilizations. But instead of lost relics, Raphael found himself on the verge of making a far more enigmatic and frightening discovery. He walked along a narrow path between the red rocks when something made him stop abruptly. In the distance, a clearing opened before him, and he felt a strange sense of discomfort, as if something were waiting for him there. Without knowing why, Raphael moved forward. When he stepped into the clearing, what he saw froze his body. A massive figure stood at the center, something that couldn't be described as human. A giant woman with an overwhelming presence. She was seated on the ground, her colossal body practically blocking the entire view of the clearing. What surprised him most was the silent crying that came from her. Heavy tears streamed down her eyes, and each drop seemed to create a small impact on the arid ground, forming tiny depressions in the dry earth. Raphael stood there, observing in silence. He didn't know whether to approach or retreat. The giant seemed absorbed in her pain, as if lost in endless lamentation, drowned in her own memories of suffering. The scene was surreal, and somehow he felt he was witnessing not just a mythological creature, but something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of time. And then the silence was broken. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, initially faint, but growing rapidly closer. Raphael turned, trying to understand where it came from. In the distance, a group of riders appeared, mounted on black horses and heavily armed, galloping in his direction. They weren't just a few riders. There were 200 of them, their formation precise, as if trained for a specific mission. They rode in absolute silence, as though they didn't want to be heard. Raphael quickly hid behind a rock, his heart racing. He didn't know who these men were or what they were doing there, but the tension was palpable. The leader of the group, a tall and somber man, rode at the front with an expressionless face. As they approached, the riders began to disperse, arranging themselves in a circle around the giant woman. The leader dismounted with a grave expression and walked toward the creature without hesitation. He looked at the giant with a mixture of disdain and fear, as if dealing with something far beyond his control. "She is here," the leader said, his voice low but filled with authority. "The last one." The giant slowly raised her head, her bright red eyes glowing in the golden sunset. She looked at the leader with a blend of pain and acceptance. Raphael watched the scene, not knowing what was happening, but sensing that this was only the beginning of something much larger and darker. The leader of the riders glanced at his subordinates and signaled with his hand. They began moving with military precision, spreading across the clearing, positioning themselves as if expecting something. But what? The giant woman, imposing and solitary, didn't move, but her gaze seemed to understand what was coming. She knew what the arrival of those riders meant. "You came to capture me, didn't you?" she said, her deep voice resonating through the still air. The leader stood firm, blade still in hand. "That is not what we want. But the cycle must be broken, and you, woman of shadows, will be the key." The tension between both sides was palpable, and Raphael didn't dare move. He felt he was at the center of something far greater, something he couldn't understand yet, but that already involved him in ways he couldn't escape. "Cycle?" the giant questioned, her voice even deeper. "The cycle is always the same. Always. You cannot break it, rider." "We shall see." The leader raised his hand again, and the riders began preparing as though for battle. But before any action could be taken, more hoofbeats sounded in the distance, louder this time. Raphael peeked over the rock and saw more riders approaching, but these were different. They weren't in formation. They rode fast, with almost desperate urgency, their horses galloping at frantic speed. The leader immediately turned toward them. "They're coming!" the new rider said, breathless. "The ancients are arriving!" Raphael didn't know what that meant, but the riders' reactions were immediate. The leader signaled sharply for all to prepare. The riders tightened their circle, blades reflecting the fading light, hands firm on the reins. They were ready, but Raphael sensed deep in his soul that what was coming would change everything. The giant, however, seemed unafraid. She simply watched, as though aware there was no escaping fate. Somewhere between the haze of her tears and the weight of rising tension, she whispered, "The war will begin again. The cycle will be eternal. But what you do not know is that no one can stop what is coming." The sound of horses' hooves grew louder, shattering the clearing silence. Raphael, still hidden, felt a chill run down his spine. The riders were preparing for something, but what? He didn't know, but he sensed it would be far more than a simple battle. Something deeper, older, was about to reveal itself. The riders, now in a defensive formation, stood like a wall of iron, but the shadows moving at the edges of the clearing were even more unsettling. They were waiting for something, or someone. The leader of the riders seemed more tense than ever, his once impassive eyes now fixed on the horizon. And then the answer came. From the dense forest surrounding the clearing, another group of riders emerged. They were unlike the others. Their horses moved like shadows, almost ethereal, their armor thinner, gleaming with an unnatural light. Raphael could see them now, and fear tightened his chest. These were no ordinary riders. They were something else. They rode without sound, as if swallowed by wind and darkness. Their eyes, when turned toward the riders, glowed red. Raphael sensed they were there for a purpose far darker than anyone realized. The leader of the riders, once unshakable, took a step back, pure terror in his eyes. The other riders trembled, hands unsteady. "The ancients," the leader whispered. "They have arrived." He looked at the giant, still unmoving but aware, more than anyone, of what was happening. She knew there was no escape. War was beginning, or perhaps beginning again. "They cannot interfere," the leader said, barely audible. "The prophecy must be fulfilled. The cycle cannot be broken." The giant responded with a slow motion of her massive hand. The earth trembled. "The cycle is eternal," she said, her grave voice echoing. "But everything has an end. The price of each war must be paid, and those who refuse will pay with their souls." The leader turned to his riders. They were nervous, but they knew they couldn't retreat. Something greater was at stake. This was not just victory, but survival. With a low shout, the leader raised his sword. "Prepare yourselves. The ancient war begins again. There is no turning back." The tension exploded. The riders moved toward the ancients, who divided into groups with unnatural ease. No immediate clash occurred, but Raphael felt the moment approaching and sensed it would not be a battle of mere steel. When the ancients moved, it was with supernatural force. Time and space seemed to bend around them. They did not attack physically, but their presence drained the strength of those nearby. And Raphael understood. The riders weren't fighting shadows. They were fighting the weight of an ancient cycle of endless war, destruction, and rebirth. And the giant woman was both guardian and victim of that cycle. She was part of it, yet the only one capable of breaking it. Raphael felt a wave of understanding, though he couldn't explain it. He realized that his presence, accidental or not, made him part of this. At the front line, the leader swung his sword again. "Advance! The fate of the world depends on our victory." But the moment his blade cut through the air, a deep, anguished cry tore through the clearing. The giant rose. Her colossal body glowed with dark energy, absorbing everything around her. With a single roar that shook the earth, she spoke. "The cycle is mine. I am the end, and the end is here." The ground vibrated. Wind roared. The shadows spiraled violently. She lifted her arms, unleashing a wave of dark light across the clearing. The riders felt the crushing force, struggling to remain standing. Raphael felt the wind, screaming around him, and knew nothing would ever be the same. The ancients, who until then had remained motionless, began to move more quickly. They were no longer simple knights, but spectres, as if death itself lived within their bones. Their armor glowed with a supernatural light, and their red eyes burned with a cold, immortal fire. The leader of the knights, who had remained calm until that moment, now seemed lost. He looked at the giantess with eyes full of rage, but also with uncontained terror. He knew that if they didn't make a decision quickly, the battle would be lost. "We cannot let her control the battlefield," he shouted, his voice echoing with growing desperation. "Advance, fight against her power. If we have to fight to the end, then we will." But contrary to what the leader expected, the knights did not advance. They were being dominated by the force emanating from the giantess. The shadows moving around them were like invisible chains, pulling them toward the center of the clearing, toward the point where the giantess awaited. Raphael watched everything with a growing sense of dread, but also with understanding. He knew the battle was not just about physical strength. It was not merely a clash of swords and horses. There was something much deeper at play, something beyond any human comprehension. The cycle the giantess had spoken of was not a simple war. It was a struggle between destiny and freedom. The giantess, in her colossal size, looked at the knights with an expression that mixed sadness and resignation. "The cycle cannot be broken," she said, her voice echoing like thunder. "You can fight as much as you want, but what lies behind this is stronger than any sword or horse. What is behind this is time itself, destiny itself." The leader of the knights gritted his teeth, struggling against the force pulling him, but he could not move. He was trapped, as were all the others, in an invisible field that emanated from the giantess. "We cannot lose," he cried, but his voice was full of doubt. He knew that no matter how hard he fought, there was something he could not defeat. Then the knight beside him, a young man with eyes full of panic, said in a trembling voice, But what about the ancients? They're not afraid of her. They aren't being affected by her power. They are..." His voice faltered as he looked at the ancients, now in a dense formation as if invoking something. The leader looked at the ancients with a mix of anger and realization. He finally understood. "They are not like us," he said, his voice low and grim. "They do not fear the giantess. They do not fear anything." Raphael, watching everything with growing apprehension, felt a wave of comprehension wash over him. The ancients were not just knights. They were something more, something that transcended human understanding. They were the forces that governed the cycle. They were the guardians of something far greater than any knight or the giantess. And then, in a sudden movement, the ancients separated, their eyes glowing with an intense red light. They began to move with supernatural speed, surrounding the giantess, but not to attack her directly. They were creating something, a network of energy spreading through the clearing, wrapping around her with a force even greater than the one she had summoned. The giantess tried to move, but the force of the network was immense. She screamed, her voice echoing across the desert like a lament carried through time. "You do not understand," she cried in pain. "You cannot understand. The cycle cannot be interrupted." Raphael felt the weight of her words. He knew that what was happening there was not a simple battle of physical forces. It was a struggle between control and freedom, between immutable destiny and the desperate attempt to change it. But no matter how hard the giantess tried, something within her power seemed to be breaking. Something was changing. "This cannot go on," Raphael whispered to himself, feeling a growing pressure in his chest. "The cycle must be broken." However, he knew that the only way to truly understand what was happening was to move closer, and more than that, act. If he did nothing, the battle unfolding would continue, immutable, like an endless cycle. And if it wasn't stopped, it could consume everything. It was time to discover what was really behind it, what the giantess meant by the cycle. The air was heavy with tension and the growing energy emanating from both the giantess and the ancients. Raphael's heart pounded as he watched the clearing, where the knights were trapped in an invisible field, fighting against an unyielding force. The giantess, despite her immense size, was being dominated by the energy network forming around her, an energy created by the ancients, who now seemed far more than mere spectres. They were guardians of an immortal cycle, and the battle was far from a simple physical confrontation. Raphael took a deep breath, trying to understand. The cycle. The giantess had spoken of it, and now he was beginning to grasp it, but he knew there was more to uncover. She wasn't merely resisting the ancients, she was trying to destroy the very concept of an inevitable destiny. "I am the key," he murmured to himself, trying to make sense of his own words. The key to ending the cycle. He looked at the knights who were losing hope. Their bodies were exhausted, their faces covered in sweat and dust, but none dared retreat. They were trapped not only by the force of the ancients, but also by the awareness that what they faced was no ordinary battle. They were dealing with forces from a place beyond human understanding. The giantess, now cornered, looked at the knights with an empty expression. "It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how many wars you fight or how many lives are sacrificed. The cycle will continue. It will always continue." The leader, silent until then, lifted his head with determination. "That cannot be. We will not allow it. If war is the only way, so be it." But before he could command anything, the ancients stepped forward. Their movement was like a wave of darkness sliding across the clearing and swallowing the knights. The air thickened, nearly impossible to breathe. Raphael felt the pressure, as if space itself was being compressed. The giantess, slowly being overtaken by the network's energy, raised her arms in one last act of resistance. "No, don't let them. Destiny cannot be sealed this way. You don't know what's at stake." The leader, panic rising, yelled, "What's at stake? What are we facing? Who are the ancients? What do they want from us?" Raphael, feeling urgency rise like fire within him, felt an inexplicable pull. The knights were losing, but perhaps he was the key. Perhaps he could change everything. He stepped out from behind the rocks and walked toward the giantess. The leader saw him and shouted, "What are you doing, boy? Go back, this is not your place." But Raphael kept walking. Something greater than him was at stake, something that needed to be understood, so the cycle could be broken. He approached, heart pounding. He looked into her eyes and felt her pain, her loneliness. "You spoke of the cycle," he said. "What do you mean? What is this cycle that never ends?" The giantess looked at him, her red eyes full of deep sorrow. "The cycle is older than you can fathom. It is not merely a series of battles, it is the fabric of time itself. Every war, every life lost, every moment of suffering is part of an eternal pattern, repeating endlessly. And when it reaches its end, when it exhausts itself, what remains is emptiness." Raphael said nothing, absorbing her words. He knew she spoke of something real, not metaphorical. The cycle was not a series of events. It was existence itself, a loop of destruction and rebirth that could not be broken. But she seemed different. She wasn't just resisting, she wanted to end destiny. "Why do you want to break it?" he asked. "Why end the cycle?" She lowered her head, tears falling like droplets filled with centuries of pain. "Because I am the last of my kind. The cycle made me who I am, brought me here, but now all I want is for it to end. No more war, no more destruction, only freedom, the freedom to choose one's own destiny." Raphael felt a wave of understanding. He didn't know how, but he sensed the answer lay within him. Before he could speak, the ancients increased their power. The network tightened, throwing the giantess back as though crushing her with an invisible force. Her screams echoed. The leader watched in despair. "It's too late. We can't stop the cycle. It is complete." Raphael felt something surge inside him. He looked at his hands. They glowed with the giantess's energy. Something was happening. He felt a transformation, a wave of power. The giantess looked at him. You can break the cycle. You are the only one." Raphael felt the responsibility. The true battle was beginning, and he stood at its center. The clearing fell silent. The giantess lay on the ground, breathing heavily, tears forming rivers around her. Raphael stood in the center, trying to process everything. He felt the power coursing through him, wild, ancient, a power he could barely control. The ancients watched him, their eyes glowed red, their presence crushing. The leader of the knights stared at Raphael, unsure of what fate awaited them. "You are the key," the giantess whispered again, "but there is a price." "What price?" Raphael asked. "The cycle cannot end without pain. To break it, someone must bear the weight of every war that ever was. And what is fought in life is carried into death. You must choose, free the world, or condemn yourself to an eternity of battles." The words pierced him. He looked at the knights, the ancients, the suffering giantess, and he knew. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply. When he opened them, something larger than himself was awake inside him. He raised his hands. The energy intensified. Wind roared. Shadows stretched. The ancients formed a circle, not to attack, but to protect the moment unfolding. "You don't understand," Raphael said. "I am the key to freedom, but freedom demands sacrifice." With one final movement, he channeled all the energy into a single point. The clearing exploded in light. Raphael was pulled into an abyss of darkness. His mind was flooded with visions, thousands of cycles, wars, deaths, rebirths. He saw the beginning, and he saw the end. Then he made his choice. He released everything, every battle, every fate, into the abyss. The cycle shattered, but the cost was immense. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. The knights were gone, the ancients were gone, the giantess had vanished. Only silence remained. Raphael lay on the ground exhausted, but the desert was calm, the sky clear. A new era had begun. The cycle was over, but a new beginning had just emerged. Raphael stood looking to the horizon where the last trace of the giantess faded. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt, finally, freedom had been won.